Cool. So that's great. So I'm joined here today by Dave Gregory. Dave used to be president of the Baptist Union in 2008 to 2019 and is currently minister at Croxley Green Baptist Church in the Central Baptist Association. Dave, it's great you could be with us.
Great. Good to be with you, Hayley. It's amazing, actually, we can connect very easily now with this technology, isn't it, across the UK?
It's amazing. And
yeah.
I just wondered whether you could just spend a couple of minutes just to explain a little bit about your background, who you are, what you're passionate about.
Okay, yeah. So my name is Dave Gregory. I'm, as you say, a local Baptist minister. My background, my life's been split into two halves, really, in terms of, I hesitate to use the word career. I don't think ministry is a career, it's a calling. But my life's had two halves to it. The first kind of 20 years of my adult life, I was a scientist and initially into astronomy and physics, and then gradually drifted into weather, meteorology, climate. Did my doctorate in thunderstorms and then ended up working at the Met Office and the European Weather Centre and the Hadley Centre for Climate Change. Basically building climate models, building these huge computer programs which predict the weather, the kind of weather you'll see on your TV screens every day. That's produced by one of these models. But we also use these models to look ahead over to the next 100 years, what might happen with the Earth's climate as human beings have affected the atmosphere with the way we live our lives. So that was the first half of my life. Kind of parallel to that professional life, I was always involved in church leadership for a long time. I was in the 90s involved in church planting locally in Bracknell in Berkshire. And then 2001, I went to train to be a Baptist minister. So I've been at this kind of game full-time, part-time, full-time now for nearly 20 years. And I guess through that time, I've found the background I had in science has become more to the fore. Interestingly, when I had my interview for ministry, the final question the regional minister asked me as I was leaving, as I was walking through the door, was how I was working for the Met Office prepared you for ministry. I think the way I answer that in the recent years has changed a little bit as the sciences start to become a bit more central to what I do in ministry. So in my presidential year, I was talking about divine windows. That was really about, instead of science pushing us away from faith, how it opens a door to encounter God through how we understand the world and how we understand nature. And also through the work I do with Messy Church. I do Messy Church to Science, and known as Dr. Dave, which is great fun. I enjoy exploring, as I say, the wonder of creation and the wonder of the Creator together. But increasingly, in the last few years, again, after a bit of a lull, I've been more engaged with issues around the environment. So that was part of my presidential year. I am now chair of a charity called the John Ray Initiative, which is a Christian educational charity around the environment, trying to engage churches. And more recently, and this is an ongoing project which we hope to launch in September, I'm convening what's called BUEN, which is good in Spanish. It stands for the Baptist Union Environmental Network, BUEN. And our aim is to gather people from across the associations, including the South Wales Association. We've already got a contact there, which we're very grateful for, to try and engage our family, our Baptist network, more in this issue of the environment and climate change over the next 10 years, 10, 15 years, because this is going to be a critical period for that will set the tone for the rest of the century, really, in terms of what our weather and climate are going to be like and what people's lives are going to be like because of that.
Well, thank you. It's great to listen to you speak about science as someone that runs away from science so often. And when you talk about climate and weather, I just think you don't need a degree in that. It rains all the time in South Wales. But,
well, that's what my wife would say, but that was after we got rained out of St. David's about 15 years ago, or 20 years ago now, yeah.
Wow. So, we use the term climate change quite a lot in our society now, in culture, and within our Baptist movement. I wondered if you could just explain it
Okay.
that it can be understood.
So maybe start with what is weather and what is climate. Okay, so weather is what is outside your window today. I don't know what it's like down your neck of the woods, Hayley. What's it like outside your window today?
Thankfully, it's sunny today.
It doesn't always rain in Wales. It's sunny here today, and the wind's dropped. It's a very pleasant day out there. So, you know, that's weather. And tomorrow that will be different. And the day after that will be different. So weather is constantly changing. The atmosphere is constantly churning around storms, sunshine, clouds, rain. It changes from day to day. What we mean by climate is if you kind of average the weather out over a month, a week, a year, 10 years, it's a kind of long-term average feel for the weather in a certain location. So that's what we mean about climate. So, you know, I get a bit annoyed when, you know, certain newspapers say, you know, we have a really bad cold winter, and they say, whatever happened to climate change? Whatever happened to global warming? Well, it's just weather, it's not climate. Climate change is when the kind of average properties of the weather of the planet shift in time. Now, we know this happens naturally. So we know, I'm living on the edge of London in a place called Croxley Green. If you'd have been here 20,000 years ago, this would have been the edge of an ice sheet. Now, if you dig down in my garden, you find gravel about 1.5 feet down, and that's what's been left by a glacier 20,000 years ago, because that was an ice age. The Earth was a lot colder 20,000 years ago, and it's warmed up since. So we know we get these big shifts in climate, and they tend to happen quite slowly. What we're worried about at the moment is what we call human-induced climate change. And we know for the last 200 years, we have been burning fossil fuels to fuel our economies and lives, and still are. We started off with coal, we moved on to gas, and then we moved on to oil, petrol, and diesel, and various other fuels to fly our planes and things like that. And when you burn those elements, they're all based on carbon. So when you burn them, they produce a gas called carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is you might come across it in fire extinguisher. It puts out fires. So you might think, oh, it damps down heat. Well, no, that's not quite the case. In the atmosphere, it acts a bit like the glass in a greenhouse. That's one way of describing it. It traps the heat of the sun and stops it escaping back into space. And the more carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet is. So there is not very much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If you had a million ping pong balls, okay, then 200 years ago, about 250 of them would have been carbon dioxide. So if you had a million ping pong balls, and that was all the atoms in the atmosphere, 250 of them would have been carbon dioxide, say red. Since over the last 250 years, we've now increased that number from 250 to around 400 ping pong balls. Now you say, well, Dave, that's not very much. But we already know that the planet has warmed 1 degree just by adding 150 ping pong balls of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So we should know this. I mean, Jesus talked about the smallest thing having the biggest effect. The mustard seed grew into the biggest tree. And carbon dioxide, very small amount in the atmosphere, but a very powerful gas to trap heat from the sun. And it's warming up the planet. Now, that's happened in about 150 years. We've noticed the temperature increased by 1 degree. In fact, most of that warming has occurred in the last 75 years, 75 to 50 years. It's happening very, very quickly. And that's much quicker than the natural cycles we see of the climate of the planet Earth happening on. So that's why we're worried. And when it happens quickly, it means that we as human beings find it difficult to adapt to those changes, because those changes in warming, the general warming of the planet, also affect the day-to-day weather systems that happen. But also the natural world can't adapt very quickly either. So we're seeing increased rates at the moment of extinction of species around the world. So these are some of the reasons we're worried about climate change that humans are causing by the way we live. because the impacts they're having both on people and on the natural world, actually on which we are part of and which we depend and are integrated into.
Wow, thank you. And there's loads in there.
Yes.
But I just wondered, when we think about justice and God's justice and God's kingdom coming,
Yeah.
what impact does that have? Why should that affect our climate?
Well, I guess justice is there's something in justice about rightness, behaving rightly to other people, behaving rightly to the creation that God said was good. And, if God says creation is good for his purpose, good to provide for us, I think that's something we should take note of and think, well, we need to behave rightly to that. So I think this idea of behaving rightly and treating things rightly is important. In terms of justice for the natural world, let's start there. We have not treated it well and are still not treating it well. So partially based on how we read the Bible for a long time, when it said in Genesis, here's creation, it's yours. Go and, populate the world. You can use it for your benefit. That's been our attitude through millennia, really. There have been occasions in Christianity where different groups have taken a different attitude. So the Celtic Christians were very interested in a connection with nature and discovering God through nature. The Franciscans, similarly, 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, were similarly inclined. But for the most part, we've seen nature as there, something to be used, something we can eat and build with and use for our benefit. And that means we almost think it's disposable. We use it and we consume it and we throw it away and we think there's always going to be something more for us. And to date, there has been. So we don't, in some ways, respect it. We don't recognize its inherent value before God. I mean, that's our theology, isn't it? Our theology often is about our salvation, our relationship with God. Actually, the Bible says, no, Jesus died for all things. All things are for Jesus. All things were made through Jesus. So I think there's a justice there to creation about treating it rightly, treating how God would ask us to treat it. Yes, it is given to us for our benefit, but that doesn't mean to say we have to overexploit it. We have to think well of it. We have to appreciate it. We have to care for it. So I think that's one aspect of justice for the environment, which climate change is relevant to. I think there's justice about people too. I think most of the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been caused historically by what we call the developed nations, the Western developed nations, the most technologically advanced, the most energy hungry nations. So we have borne the brunt of the responsibility of putting this stuff into the atmosphere. There are other countries now which, because they're trying to develop in the same way as we did, China, India, Brazil, they are now producing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In fact, their contributions are going up while our contributions are coming down. But we bear the responsibility. Places in the world which they have contributed much less to climate change. In Africa, South America, other parts of the world where still their carbon dioxide emissions are very, very small compared to our own. They've not contributed much, but they're bearing the first brunts of climate change. So a lot of those people live in very marginal climates where it gets very hot already. And a small increase in temperature makes life even more difficult. The shifting patterns of rainfall and droughts and storms make life much more difficult when you're living in a wooden shack or are just farming your local patch of land and you're dependent on that for food. So the issues of justice are between rich and poor in this. And to be honest, we are the rich. We are the rich. Now, I know sometimes people here feel very poor, but compared to other people globally, we are the rich. So there are issues of justice there between the developed and the undeveloped world, between sharing of resources. I think there are also issues of generational justice as well with this. You know, I've lived as part of a world where, well, you know, since I got involved professionally in this area, I've become much more aware of our impact upon the environment. I think for probably, you know, the first 30 years of my life, I was less aware, or first 20 years, 25 years of my life. So I've contributed to this problem through the way I've lived my lives. The children who are being born now, or the Gen Zs, you know, the children on the age of 20, or those getting into the 30s, the millennials now, they're the ones who are going to feel the biggest impact of this down the line. So I think there are questions of generational justice. The way we have lived our lives has not blessed our future generations. And so I think that, for me, that's another reason for wanting to do something about this, to make a difference, to try and think how we live differently, corporately as nations, as a world, but also as an individual and also as churches. Because this thing is something we're going to live with for the rest of this century and beyond. And that will impact upon these younger lives that we have around us today, and the next generations. And it's great that their voices are being raised up in this over the last 18 months, 2 years. They're the ones who are leading and saying, look, we want a different world. And I think they're right to complain and to protest and to raise up that issue. And we need to listen to that. We need to listen to that.
Absolutely. You've mentioned theology in there, and how in Genesis, you know, we may have got this skewed theology. We think actually it's ours, we can use it and dispose of it.
Yeah.
What about some of us that maybe feel like, well, God's going to create a new heaven and a new earth, so does it really matter what we do?
Well, that's true, and I don't know when he's going to do that. You know, you can take that as a point of time. Maybe you can take that also as a statement of hope, which you want to kind of hold on to in every generation, whatever time you have. So, you know, I have a way of looking at this these days in terms of order and disorder in the world, and I think that those two things go to the heart of both what nature is like and what Easter is about. So, you know, Jesus enters the disorder of the world when he dies on the cross. That's one way you might describe it. And God raises him back to life, which is a statement of God's desire to bring order to the world. And I think as Christians, I want to ask the question, as a Christian, do I want to be part of the disorder? Or do I want to be working with God to maintain and bring order? You know, that picture of new creation at the end of the Bible talks about there being no ocean, no sea. You know, as a meteorologist and, you know, as a geophysicist, which involves the ocean as well, I'm not sure if that's a great thing, because the sea is very interesting. But theologically, the sea was always this image of disorder in the Bible, in right from the start, right through to the end. The sea is an image of disorder, and what God is saying at the end of it, look, I'm bringing order to this, a new order, no pain, no crying, no mourning. And I kind of think, yeah, that's what I want to be part of now, never mind the far future. And I think climate change is working against the ordering of the world that God's bringing about, the extinction rates increasing, the you know, the life in the oceans is under threat and under pressure. That's to me is increasing the disorder that we see in the world. And I, as a Christian, want to be part of working with God to kind of walk in step with the order that he wants to bring. That's resurrection life to me. And that's what Jesus came to bring. I don't want to be adding to the disorder that people face in their lives.
Thank you. And you said there that actually the young people, Gen Zs and others, are really raising this, and that's true for me. I think it was my youth group, well, even younger than youth actually, in my previous church that kind of met you and were inspired by you, but also were kind of battering my door down about what can we do as a church. And there's a bit of part of me that goes, oh, is it really that urgent? Because it doesn't seemingly affect my life, and I guess there's many of us like that. So why is it so important to look into it now?
I mean, I met your youth group, and they were great. I one of the good things I enjoy doing is going into schools. So I go into some local schools around here. I've been into primary schools from year up down to year 2. I've been to talk to sixth formers about these issues. I'm amazed at actually in the primary schools how much they know about this already, much more than the teachers do, much more probably than their parents do, although, you know, some of them are getting their parents to join in with this. So that excites me and thrills me, and always brings a smile to my face when I see that. Why is it so urgent? Because people's lives are being changed now, and we don't always see it. We don't always think about it. You know, there are people living in Pacific Islands now who, you know, I heard quotes from them over 10 years ago which said, look, our lands are being flooded by sea level rise because the sea's levels are increasing due to melting ice, but also the water's getting warmer. And I heard them call out to the churches in the West to get involved in this. Well, at the last UN climate conference a few years ago, I think in Madrid, the one that had to be shifted from Chile to Madrid, those same islanders gave the same plea, not only to the church, but to the Western world, because after 15 years or more, the sea levels are still rising. Their towns, their villages, their cities are being flooded. So this is an urgent issue for a lot of people in the world. And it will continue to get worse, and quickly worse, if we don't do something about it. So at the moment, we're 1 degree. We might be 5 degrees by the end of this century if we don't do something about it. And that will mean, you know, even our coastline starts to be threatened by that kind of sea level rise. We're not talking meters. We're talking maybe a meter by the end of the century. But some of our low-lying areas are already prone to flooding. We've seen a lot more flooding in the last 10 years than I remember as a child. Maybe because we built houses on the wrong places, but it seems that our rainfall is more erratic, more intense. It is starting to shape people's lives already. And that will only increase to more and more people. So we have a choice in this next decade what kind of world we are going to live with. If we do nothing, 5 degrees, no ice at the poles. Already in summer, the ice is very thin at the North Pole. I read yesterday that there's real worries about the polar bears being able to get enough food to eat now, because the sea ice is getting very thin. They just can't travel the distances on the sea ice that they need to get the food. So if we all implement what was agreed in Paris a few years ago to restrict CO2, we're looking at 3 degrees. The science tells us 1.5 degrees is good. Well, it still has impacts, but they're not as bad as 2 degrees or 3 degrees. But we're not heading there yet. And this, as I say, this next 10 years will set the trajectory of whether we're going to end up with 3 or 4 or 5, or be able to get down to 2 or even 1.5, which probably is going to be very difficult to go down to 1.5, but we might be able to hit 2. So it is urgent. But one of the difficulties is, you know, we think urgent is 4 years. That's our political cycle. We think urgent is next week. We don't think urgent is 40 years. But unless we take it seriously now, it'll be too late in 10 years or 15 years to make the difference that we do need to make. So we're struggling to see it as urgent because we don't work on these timescales. We don't work on those kind of timescales.
I guess if we're going to really grasp it as an emergency, that means making changes. Mm-hmm. And obviously, you're broadcasting to the South Wales Baptist Association, and there's a pain of generations that lost livelihoods,
Yeah.
and communities that have never been restored since the coal mines were transformed. How do we work in that tension of justice for who?
Yeah, I understand that pain because I grew up in a coal mining town. My grandfather was a coal miner. My other grandfather worked on the railways on steam trains, so he's dependent on coal. Our entire town revolved around mining, neighbours and things like that. I'd kind of left by the time we lost all the mines. But I still have friends and family there, and I know what impact that had upon them. I know what impact it had upon my generation leaving school. People out of work for 6-7 years as all the heavy industry disappeared, as well as the coal mines. And that's painful for me. But on the other hand, I also think, sadly, that we can't go back to those kind of industries. We can't go back to using coal. It's just too dirty and too damaging for the wider world. But I mean, it's a question of where's the hope in this, and for those communities affected, that's difficult. And I know partially there's been political failures through the years to resolve some of those issues where the community is right. As Baptist Union president, I went to the Conservative Party conference, which I've been to the Liberal Democrat and the Conservative Party conference, and I went around their exhibition stand, and I was really surprised to find a stand, the Coal Areas Regeneration Trust. This was, 30 years after the pits had shut, and they're still trying to regenerate those areas. So I understand that pain, but there's more pain down the line if we're not careful. And part of that pain is ours, but part of it is in the developing world as well. So, and they have dilemmas as well. So I was talking to somebody from Ghana recently, or last year, about the issues of climate change. Ghana has coal. Ghana has oil. It sells its oil to fund its education and healthcare system. And if we say don't sell the oil, we're not going to buy the oil, then their culture, their society suffers, just as our coal areas have suffered actually over the last 30 years. And they also have some good ores there that certain countries want to extract. Unfortunately, the ore lies under a nice area of forest, which provides some of the main water sources for the capital. So, there's a tension though, if we mine the ore, that gives us money to fund our society. But on the other hand, if they chop down the forest, they'll lose their water source, which feeds the capital. So there are these dilemmas there. The pain of now, the pain of the subsequent generations, in a sense, and they're not easy to resolve. That's part of the dilemmas that we all have to face. It could be, if we switch to renewable energies, that there are new technologies which, manufacturing technologies which will replace some of those older industries, and that has to be the hope, that we find new ways of giving livelihoods and hope to people, even as we make this transition. I think the fear is, especially in some of your communities, when they've gone through industrial transitions in the past, it's certainly not been pain-free, and the legacy has lasted for generations too. So I can understand some of the fear about this talk that this talk might generate in some of the communities which are still hurting from the past. Yeah, I don't have easy answers for that. I don't think anybody does.
No, and for us as Christians, as people that try and follow the way of Jesus, it's putting that to our forefront of preferring each other.
Yeah,
And
community, yeah.
God's kingdom.
Mm.
But there's still a part of me that thinks this is massive. What can I do? What can we churches do to get involved?
Yeah, well, that was a question a sixth former asked me earlier on this year, just for lockdown. You know, isn't this too big? What can I do, actually? And I said, well, look, you know, have you noticed in supermarkets now you get paper bags, not plastic ones? Because a year ago that wasn't true. Until David Attenborough did his program one night, emphasizing plastic in the oceans, and we woke up. And people stopped using plastic bags in supermarkets, and they very rapidly realized that if they wanted to maintain custom, they had to switch. So they switched to paper bags. I know some people still use plastic bags, but a lot of people now use the brown paper bags like we had when I was a kid. Maybe that's a little thing, although it's related to a very big problem of plastics in the ocean. That's another issue, the environment, that you could talk about. Well, I guess I'm using that as an example, because if you do something as an individual, if enough of us do something as an individual, it makes a difference. People start to notice and sit up and notice. It's that mustard seed parable again. Smallest seed grows into the biggest tree, which the birds of the air nest in, you know. So small things matter. That's what I'd say to people. What you do as an individual matters, because if enough people do it, it will mount up. What an individual church does matters, because it's a signpost to your community of where you think hope is, where you think God's life is, you know. So, you know, thinking about getting involved with the eco congregation scheme, or the eco church scheme, sorry, that's the old name for it, the eco church scheme, which just enables you to think as a church what your environmental footprint is in terms of how you travel and how you heat your building, and the kind of way you do things together in the church. That would be a good place to start. We made some transitions 18 months ago when we had Living Lent, which encouraged us to think about how we use energy, how we travel, what we buy, do we buy locally, give up single-use plastics, eat less meat. That's a hard one. Buy nothing new, which is easy for me. I'm a bloke. We don't buy many new clothes at the time. So we tried to give up single-use plastics. That was impossible, but we did try to. So in the end, we tried to minimise single-use plastic, and we did. Our recycling bin is not as full as it used to be when it gets collected. We didn't want to give up meat totally. We gave up red meat to a large extent, apart from on Sundays where it's allowable because that's festival day. But we gave up red meat. We focused more on chicken and fish. And then, you know, we did Living Lent again this year. And I think we even reduced the amount of chicken we eat and went much more to a vegetable-based diet. Now that all makes a difference, because meat, you know, generates more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases which warm the planet than a vegetable-based diet. So it's about taking steps along the way, not about making the huge change all in one leap, but taking the gradual steps that will make a difference over the long term. But that means you need this kind of thought in the back of your mind that this is important, that I'm on this journey, and this is a journey I'm sharing with Jesus. Really, this is the heart of bringing life to the world and to people in the world. So I think those little steps are important, but it's that awareness that this is a key core part of what our Christian, our church life, our life needs to be about.
That's great. And I participated in Living Lent when a few years ago, and then the subsequent years, and we did it as a church.
Yeah.
And I did that quite intentionally as the minister. So I thought, if I do this on my own, I'm so not going to be accountable. I'm going to slip. And there's something about just using that time,
yes,
to make a real change in community. And it was tough at first. It was really tough, but we got there. And we did it the first year as a corporate thing. Last year I did it. Well, this year it was you know, we weren't gathered, so I did it more of a private thing because of lockdown.
And I wonder what impact it was having. And I didn't know until after Lent, because then conversations came out. So, well, I did this. Oh, and I thought about that. So I did something else. And yeah, it had started to nudge people's behavior. And I think that's the important thing. It's about nudging people onto a new way of going. Often in church life over the years, I've talked about making 1 degree shifts. You know, you can make a huge 90-degree shift in church life. But actually, sometimes if you make 1 degree shifts over a number of time, you will significantly change direction of things. And maybe that's easier to think about. So I think we're talking about 1 degree shifts when it comes to the way we live our lives and think about how we care for creation, care for the environment.
Thank you. And one of the things I learned from living Lent was it actually gave me a real opportunity to share the gospel with my non-Christian friends.
Yeah.
They looked at me and said, well, why are you doing that? And for maybe the first time in a long time, they saw the church as being engaged in an issue they cared about as well.
Yeah.
And so we've all got these leveled effects.
Yeah. So I was in a meeting with some of our local school teachers because they want to get an environmental project running. And I was the only minister in that meeting. And I'm welcomed into that meeting because I have a similar interest to their interest to protect the environment and engage young people and children in taking that journey for the future as well. So I think this potentially has a great capacity to engage with our wider communities in what we would say a missional sense, and especially with some of the we talk about as Baptist churches want to engage with millennials and children, young people. I think it is an important thing for that as well. And it's not about them, at the start of it, it's not about them totally buying into who we are. It's walking alongside one another, see where the journey takes you. But, having that common passion and interest to make a difference to creation and to the world. I think that's where it starts.
That's great. Thank you, Dave.
It's a pleasure.